Hello, and welcome to Connecticut at Arms, the show that talks about Connecticut residents, past and present, at times of war. I'm your host, Kevin Drake. Tonight we're going to step back into World War II. While the men were overseas fighting at distant shores, it was the women that would man the factories to build the tanks, planes, and bombs that would help turn the tide of the war and make us successful and victorious. Those women were known as Rosie the Riveters, but there's so much more to that story. Tonight, our guest is Gretchen Caulfield. She is involved with the Connecticut chapter of the American Rosie the Riveter Association. Welcome to the show,
Hi,
Gretchen.
Kevin. Thank you.
So tell us how you got involved.
Well, my grandmother worked for Chance Vaught in Stratford, Connecticut during World War II, building the Corsairs and building the landing gear. And through the years, she shared her stories with us about her war work, some of the stories about when she went to Chance Vaught, her commute, some of the more humorous stories about her work. And I started thinking about, what do you do with all this information and all of these memories that she had? Where does it go? What happens to it later on in life? My children, my grandchildren someday. I wanted to find a place where I could document it and put her story down. So I started doing some research, and I found the American Rosie the Riveter Association. Dr. Fran Carter is the founder, and she herself was a riveter during World War II, building the B-29 bombers. And she was in 1998 at a conference talking about her experiences as a riveter. And when she was with other women who were also riveters, they realized that there was no organization that honored the women who worked on the home front during World War II. So she founded the organization, and in 1999, they had their first convention. So this year will be the 20th anniversary and the 20th convention of the American Rosie the Riveter Association. And I'm excited to be part of it because being able to record your family's stories and the history of what the women did during World War II is so crucial in being able to preserve that for children and their children someday.
Wonderful. I've always wondered about the term Rosie the Riveter, and you've seen the posters and billboards. Tell us, what is a Rosie the Riveter, and tell us what they did as well.
Okay, well, I get that question a lot, especially at events. People hear the term Rosie the Riveter and they think that it's exclusively riveters. So if I say, do you have a Rosie in the family? People will say, oh no, my grandmother didn't rivet. However, the term Rosie is more of an affectionate term which covers the working women of World War II on the home front and as well as the volunteer women. So just to give you an example of the women who worked on the home front, it was the women who filled positions in the defense industry and jobs that were normally held by men. And as they left for war, these positions needed to be filled. Also, war production needed to be accomplished, and it wasn't going to happen from the vacancies that the men left when they had to go fight. So the women filled these roles, and they include forestry, which a lot of people don't think about in the Northwest. There are wonderful photos of women who were carrying large saws. They were chopping the trees down, and they were filling those roles when the men weren't there in the Northwest to cut the trees down. Farmers, the farm work would be gone. We needed harvesting and planting, so we had women farmers, sanders, welders, women who were bullet makers, uniform sewers, parachute folders, assembly line workers, factory workers, bus drivers, crane operators, and the list goes on. So it's not necessarily just the riveters, it's the women who really had to take on mostly male work. But it also includes some of the clerical workers who worked for defense, because that was important as well, and those roles needed to be filled in order to keep the war protection going. Now, what you sometimes don't think about is even the small parts that went into the aircraft, such as the ball bearings. So those factories also had women working in them. And also Rosie the Riveter wasn't just a particular type of woman. You had single women who moved across the states to find war work. We had women who were married and women who had children, and they went to work even though they had children at home. And they didn't have the daycare or the child care that we have today. It was difficult to try to juggle the children at home with the work. And some families accomplished this by having alternating shifts. So the husband would go to work for one shift and the wife would take the second shift so that the children would have a parent home. Other times they'd have a relative watch the child. So that was something to think about when these women stepped up to the plate and took on these jobs in the war industry. By the end of World War II, 65% of the aircraft workers were women, and about 1,000 women also stepped up to ferry the airplanes from the factories to the bases. So these were jobs that then freed up men, the pilots especially, that could then go and serve while the women ferried the airplanes stateside. So the other thing I want to point out is that the women wanted to be there. They wanted to do their part. They felt like they wanted to support the soldiers. They were their husbands, their fiancés, their brothers who were fighting, and they wanted to do the best job they could because their product was going out there. The airplanes were being flown by their brothers or by their husbands, and they took their job seriously. They were excellent workers. They took pride in their work. Another interesting fact is that sometimes the women were able to transfer their homemaking skills to their war work. So you might see a woman ironing in the factory. She was ironing a self-sealing gas tank, maybe at Goodyear. A seamstress who would normally lay out patterns for fabric efficiently would be laying out patterns for sheet metal. And people who were sewers made great riveters. You had women with the delicate hands to be able to do delicate electrical work. And petite women were able to get into the small spaces of aircraft, to get their hands into small spaces as well for building the vehicles, the aircraft. So they brought something to the production industry.
Oh, absolutely. And you know, you don't even think about, as you mentioned, the pattern that they would lay out and how certain professions in their everyday life would transfer over into the building of weapons,
right,
and building of the tanks. And I find that extremely fascinating because I've spoke to a few Rosies, and they had told me what they endured. And one was a welder, mm-hmm, and one was a riveter. And some of the work that they did was phenomenal. I mean, I think that would even be taxing for me. Yeah. And to think that they did that, and they not only that, but they also did it with the utmost care, as you just mentioned, because they knew that their sons or fathers or husbands were overseas.
Right.
That's fascinating to me, fascinating. Now, do we have any Rosies in Connecticut, and do we have any stories that you might share with us?
Yes. We can talk about the two Connecticut Rosies I'd like to discuss are women who really witnessed the development and the creation of aircraft in Connecticut. So you discussed aircraft with the Connecticut Air and Space Center before, and how in Stratford the development of aircraft really happened here in Connecticut. It's quite exciting, the history of aircraft. So first I want to talk about Pat Handy. She is a woman who grew up in Stratford, and she recalls being 8 years old, sitting at Bearsley Park and seeing the airplanes fly out from Bridgeport Airport.
She was in the graphic that was just up. If we could put that graphic back up, please.
Yes. And she even thought when she was 8 years old, I want to be a pilot. So when she was 17 years old, she went to Allentown, Pennsylvania with some girlfriends and got her fixed wing pilot license, with the hopes and dreams of becoming a commercial pilot. Once the war started, she wanted to join the Women's Air Corps, and she would be flying and ferrying then the military aircraft across the country. However, she was 1/2 inch too short.
Oh.
And even with a stretching regime that she tried to make that cut off, she was unsuccessful. So she got a wartime job at Vought Sikorsky. She was a personal assistant at Vought Sikorsky, and a job opening came up as a helicopter flight observer, so a helicopter flight test observer. She would sit, if you saw in the photo, in the front of the R4 helicopter. She's there with the glass, and it was a tandem setup, so the pilot is actually sitting behind her, and she would be recording the vibrations and other information while they were developing the helicopters. Eventually, Sikorsky Aircraft branched off on their own, and she continued working as this helicopter test flight observer throughout the war. And by 1947, when the war was over, she became, by training with Sikorsky Aircraft, the very first female American solo helicopter pilot.
Wow.
So it's really exciting that it happened here in Connecticut,
Right here in
and
Connecticut.
in Stratford, and in the Connecticut Air and Space Center's location when she first started as a helicopter flight test observer. So it's very exciting.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Now, we had a show previously with the Connecticut Air and Space Center, and very knowledgeable group of gentlemen that were here, and they enlightened me about Igor Sikorsky, Chance Vaught, and Gustav Whitehead, and they have a display down at the museum.
They have a Rosie display, yes.
Exactly.
Yes.
Could you
it's
tell us a little bit
wonderful.
about that?
They have a Rosie display. Actually, my grandmother has a tool donated there because when she was working building the landing gear, she wanted to find a tool that had a better grip to it. So she went out on her own and purchased her own tool to build the landing gear, and her tools donated there, as well as other Rosie the Riveter items that the museum has collected over time. And I highly recommend, it's a gem of Connecticut to go and visit,
absolutely.
and they're all volunteers and so knowledgeable. It's something to see.
And it's actually where history was made.
It's where Chance Vaught was building the Corsairs and where the helicopters were being developed when it was Vought Sikorsky.
So
Yes.
I would advocate all our viewers to please look that up, the Connecticut Air and Space Center in Stratford, Connecticut. Now, there's another Connecticut pioneer, Rosie the Riveter. Could you tell us about her?
Yeah, no, this is interesting because she also worked in Stratford at Chance Vaught, but she had a completely different experience. But it also is interesting the way she intersected with flight development. Val Snowden. So Val Snowden moved from Scranton, Pennsylvania, to come to Chance Vaught to work in the office. She first started, there were no office openings, so she ran blueprints from engineering to the plant and back again. And while she did this every day, she saw the helicopter, which was an invention. She never saw a helicopter before. Found out that Igor Sikorsky was there developing his helicopter, and about daily she would walk by and they would greet each other on her way while she delivered the blueprints. She eventually went to night school to go from a typist then to a secretary in the office of the engineering department. And her boss then was looking for somebody who would be able to serve as a model to start advertising to recruit women, more women, to Chance Vaught to work in the factories. So they asked her if she would model for them. She really didn't know what they wore. She wore a skirt to work. She went down to the factory floor to see what the women were wearing and bought her clothes, put them together, stood at the photography area in the art department, and they took if you have the photo up,
Could we have the previous graphic to that, please?
they took a photo of her. She's standing on a box. She's holding the riveter, and she was asked to look out as if she's thinking about a loved one. And that's what the original pose looked like. And then the artist went in and then changed her clothes around a bit, changed what she was stepping on. You see a plain part now. Her shirt's a little bit different. And then he drew in the Corsair shooting down an enemy airplane.
Oh, wow.
And that's why it says Ladies' Day on the battlefront. It's a whole ad that was in the tri-state area, and it was in magazines encouraging women to work for the war effort.
Interesting.
And she also saw this in billboard form in Bridgeport on the rooftops on her train ride back to Pennsylvania. So she became a bit of a local celebrity.
I think we have a graphic of that
Yeah.
on the building.
There it is up there. Now that part of the street in Bridgeport no longer exists. There's a building in its place on the street that takes up the whole block, but if you see on the top of the rooftop, it says, "Help build Corsairs." So yeah, she actually also, while she was working in the engineering department, saw Charles Lindbergh one day, and she went up to him and asked him for his autograph, and he said, "Just keep it quiet that I'm here," and he gave her an autograph, which the family still has.
Wonderful.
So she really touched the pioneers of aviation while she was working and got to see things in development. And the very aircraft that she was advertising was the aircraft that her husband flew in the Navy. He was training on the Corsairs.
Really?
So it's really lovely to see that, how that all ties together.
Fabulous. You know, and they have a Corsair down at the Connecticut Air and Space Center that they're refurbishing.
They do.
And I would encourage everyone to stop by because that's just...
It's a beautiful airplane, and it's amazing to see in real life.
See, I never knew her husband was flying the Corsairs. And Charles Lindbergh, I mean, he must have, I'm surprised he didn't ask for an autograph as well, because she was so famous.
Right.
So now, tell us a little bit about your chapter here in Connecticut.
Well, our chapter started because we wanted to see more history of Connecticut families and Rosies in the archives of the American Rosie the Riveter Association. So our chapter's goal is to really encourage families to look into their neighbors and their relatives and their friends, to ask them about the Rosies and their families, and to encourage them to write down the stories or even honor them with a certificate. So when you become a member of the American Rosie the Riveter Association, it's an application fee, and that's it. There's no other obligation. It's great to give somebody a present who, you know, was a Rosie or a descendant of a Rosie, and it honors them. Also, we're just encouraging people to reach out to us because we can help them write short biographies. Sometimes people think they don't have a lot of information about their Rosie, and after speaking with them and asking them a few questions, you really can get some beautiful stories about them, whether it's about their work or even their life in a rooming house, which we've done before, learning about how they lived when they were working for the war industry. So again, just being able to document your story, finding out about your family history before the details are forgotten. And that's what we encourage people to do. We got a phone call from one Rosie recently who received her certificate in the mail, and she was just so excited. She called me up and she said, "I framed it, I've been showing it to my friends, I showed it to my sister-in-law," and again, it's just a lovely way to honor the women who sacrificed and worked on the home front for the war.
So what would you say to our viewers that may have had an aunt or mother or grandmother that was a Rosie? Would you encourage them to get in contact with you to tell you their story?
I would. Contact me. I would love to be able to help them with a short biography, or if they don't have the details, even to join the American Rosie the Riveter Association, because once they do, they get quarterly newsletters about what's happening around the country with not only the Rosies, but the chapters that are doing things for Rosies to honor them. And it comes in the mail, and it's just a nice, it's just nice information to have about how people around the country are honoring and preserving their stories.
And how do you use these stories? Is there sort of a national archive?
There's a national archives, and in the past, with the permission of the Rosies or their families, if they wish, the Rosie the Riveter Association has published the short biographies in books. So they've gathered 100 stories for each book, and they've published 6 books. And it's that's also a wonderful gift because people can see what Rosies have done throughout the country, some of the details, the stories behind their experiences. But we do keep their identities private. So we don't publicize people, we don't give out information, we don't share their information or their addresses with anybody. When they publish the story, it's up to the families to wish to publish the Rosie stories, but we don't share or give mailing lists out, or we protect their privacy.
Right. Well,
That's very important to the founder as well.
Oh, absolutely. But I would think that anyone that has some knowledge that they would like to share about a loved one, I would strongly encourage you to look up Gretchen, and we will post the Facebook page to the Connecticut chapter, so they can get in touch with you at the end of the show. Is that website? We'll post it at the end of the broadcast as well. But could you tell us what that is?
Our website,
Yes.
our chapter website is ctroses.org,
Okay.
and the national website is rosietheriveter.net.
RosieTheRiveter.net.
Yeah.
And is there anything else that you're in the process of doing?
Well, we're getting ready for the national convention, so
The
we're very
national
excited to be
convention.
seeing that. That's in New Orleans.
It's in New Orleans.
Yeah,
Oh,
and
wonderful.
Rosies from all over the country come in, and we're excited to be seeing them and talking to them, and it's going to be wonderful. Can I talk to you a bit about the volunteer Rosies?
Absolutely.
Okay, well, volunteer Rosies, part of Rosie the Riveter is also women who volunteered during World War II. So if they weren't able to work and get a war job for various reasons, you know, the war touched everybody. And so there were daily reminders about the war happening through food rationing, sugar rationing, shoe rationing. There were even there were Vicky Victory hairpins encouraging women not to throw their hairpins away because they wanted to conserve the steel. So everyday life was part of the war effort. And if women didn't work during the war, they certainly did volunteer during the war. And we consider those Rosie the Riveters too. So when we talk about Rosies with the Rosie the Riveter Association, we talk about volunteer Rosies as well. And their jobs consisted of their volunteer jobs running scrap drives, so conserving the scrap metal for the war effort. And these people ranged from toddlers all the way up to the elderly. So there were stories of 4-year-olds who would collect gum wrappers and make it into a ball of metal for the scrap drive. Girl Scouts would clank their pans around the neighborhood to encourage people to take whatever they could and any metal that they could spare and put that out for the war effort. Rolling bandages was an example. There were examples of aircraft spotters. The Army would train women to go to their posts and look for enemy aircraft. So it was manned sometimes 24 hours a day. And there's actually a aircraft observation post still in existence, and it's one in 14,000 that was across the country. That's still this one is the only known one in existence, and it's in Connecticut.
Oh, really?
It's in Hebron, Connecticut, and it was restored. So it's a wonderful, again, another field trip that someone might want to go to.
Sure.
And they would look out for the enemy aircraft in case it came by, and that was volunteer. And knitters, that's another huge contributor. The women that knitted during World War II, providing the hats and the vests for the soldiers. Once we got into the war, there were supplies that were needed. So there was a big push for knitting. And we have a story of a woman who knitted a watch cap a day every day throughout the entire war.
Oh my goodness.
Dedicated knitters. And they were able to teach other women too. So wherever you were able to help with the war effort, knitting. People sold victory stamps. And again, the list goes on. So, so when you ask, is there a Rosie in your family, it's not just if they worked, it's also just amazing contributions in a volunteer fashion that people made.
Right down to the children.
Right down to the children.
Isn't that amazing?
Growing victory gardens, canning the food, those all count, because that was something that instead of using your rationing stamps, you were supplementing your food with your garden. So we have a story of a woman who was in charge of the family's tomatoes. She had to can them, she had to take care of the tomatoes. She sold her victory stamps, and those were all her volunteer jobs when she was 16 years old.
Isn't that amazing?
So
just
yeah.
how everyone pulled together.
Everybody pulled together.
Wow. That's wonderful.
Yeah.
Maybe we'll see it in our lifetime again, wherever, not so much a war, but where we all pull together as a nation.
Yeah.
Well, Gretchen, I can't thank you enough for stopping by and teaching us so much about Rosie the Riveter and much, much more. And we will have the website up and the Facebook page so our viewers can follow that. And I'd like to thank our viewers for tuning in today. And I hope you enjoyed our presentation of Rosie the Riveter. And to all our veterans out there, I want to say thank you for your service from the bottom of my heart. I'm Kevin Drake. Good night.